Well, hello everyone. This is my first video since the presidential election in the United States last Tuesday. A few people have asked me to comment on it because it was a pretty big deal. A great political change has taken place. And of course, Jehovah's Witnesses say, well, we're not political and we don't vote and all of that. But you are affected by the outcomes of this, whether you realize it or not. Over the course of the last 4 years here in the United States, we've been subjected to a lot of evils that weren't there before. It was like on day one when the new administration took over from Trump's first presidency. They nullified all of the laws he had put in effect to secure the border. And over the course of the last 4 years, approximately 10 million illegals have flooded into the United States. So you say, well, I'm not political. Well, a lot of these illegals are illegals. They're criminals. For example, to take advantage of the situation, Venezuela emptied out all of their prisons and insane asylums, mental institutions, I guess they call them now. The worst hardened criminals, gang members and murderers, rapists, drug dealers. Welcome to America. And over the course of the last 4 years, besides the lockdown treatment we were given, we've been subjected to this ideology of the LGBTQ community. And it's not that they just want the freedoms to practice their whatever, but they want the right to promote it, to promote their sexual perversions and deviations upon children. And so we were subjected to drag queen story hour at the public library and, the gay pride flags and classrooms and a lot of really evil things. And so I think what we saw with this re-election of Donald Trump was the average person saying, this isn't the way we want to go with this country. And in the United States, supposedly, that's, it's the government is for the people, by the people, of the people, right? So it looks like it worked, sort of. I mean, considering what Donald Trump had against him, the entire media machine, and, painting him as a Nazi and a Hitler, and he's going to, bring fascism to the United States. He's going to start locking people up, which he should, I would imagine, because there's been a lot of illegal games run against him. And in spite of all of that, the lawfare waged against him, there was a very coordinated effort through the state prosecutors and 2 assassination attempts, maybe 3, they say. And he emerged from that. So Donald Trump wants to, make America great again. That was his campaign slogan. And, he's convinced people that he knows how to do it. But really, this election here in the United States, it's not a Republican-Democrat thing. It is really a struggle between globalist and nationalist. The Bible talks about that, doesn't it? The iron and the clay, the empire and the republics. And it's not just America where that struggle, that contest is being played out. Europe is going through the same thing, essentially. Only they've been hamstrung by being part of this EU, which is already a sort of an empire located in Brussels. But some of the nations of Europe are now wanting to bring back, nationalist leaders because they see the destruction that has been brought upon them and the economic ruin, especially in Germany. So, from my perspective, this is the struggle between the king of the north and the king of the south. And although, I come from the perspective of Jehovah's Witnesses doctrinally, and I believe that Christ is using them to preach the good news, however, these are not the last days. And Christ did not return in 1914. That wasn't the beginning of the final part of the days or the time of the end or any of that. And some might say, well, how could they be so wrong and still be used by God? And I've explained that in quite a few places, books and essays and videos. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a congestion and cold here. I'm kind of stuffed up. But Jehovah allows for an operation of Satan to delude people into believing this fiction that Christ has come, that he's already ruling as king, and that Satan has been thrown down. Because when it does occur, then Jehovah wants to see where we line up. If our faith is in this watchtower, or if we really believe what we've been taught in the scriptures about the kingdom and all of that. So, anyway, as far as prophecy is concerned, I don't believe the time of the end is begun. And in Daniel 11:40, it talks about this pushing. The king of the north and the king of the south will engage in a pushing. Actually, it says the king of the north will engage in a pushing against the king of the south will engage with a pushing against the king of the north. And the king of the north will respond, and he will storm and flood over the nations. And he will conquer and subjugate his longtime nemesis, the king of the south. And that is evident if you go on down and read that he will rule over the hidden treasures. And it says the king of Egypt will not escape. Egypt was the original king of the north. I've mentioned that many times. And the Watchtower knows that as well, because they actually explain that, only in terms that Great Britain and the United States are the king of the south, and the USSR was the king of the north, and it ruled over the hidden treasures of the United States during the Cold War. I don't know how they come up with that, but they say that they forced the United States to spend too much of their treasury on armaments to stay up with the Soviet Union, and the truth is the exact opposite. And some say that Reagan intentionally ramped up armaments to bankrupt the USSR. And of course, it did go belly up. But no, I believe that this may be the initial phase of the pushing. And because the globalists are not going to just sit back and say, well, we lost. All the years and money and initiative that we spent to set up a world government, and I guess we'll just have to let the nationalists have their way. After all, they're good people on both sides. No, that's not going to happen. I don't think. And I think that they're already preparing something very nasty. There was an organization in Britain that the day after Trump was elected, they immediately began trying to organize to get permission for Ukraine to fire longer range missiles into Moscow and St. Petersburg. And of course, Putin said, if you do that, we'll have to respond. And we'll be hitting targets in Europe, not in Ukraine, in Europe. Brussels, Paris, are you listening? Actually, they thought it was a cut and dried deal. On September the 13th, Of course, Great Britain signed off on Ukraine going ahead, but they needed the United States permission because they need their expertise for satellite geopositioning, and they'd have to have their men on the ground really to help them fire these larger ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and what have you. And surprisingly, President Biden didn't agree to it. And so all's quiet for a little while. But now they're trying to get it going before Trump takes office to try to, what would essentially be to ignite a third world war. And of course, they've always got the boiling cauldron there in the Middle East. If Israel decides to shoot some more missiles into Iran and elicit a response, President Trump has already given his undying support to Israel, whatever it takes, we've got you. So there is a scenario, I think it was Henry Kissinger came up with this, the breakaway ally scenario, that the empire can use an alliance. Well, it's sort of like NATO. If one nation is attacked, they all have to respond. Article 5, right? So Israel has this power now, this tremendous power. This tiny little nation has control over the administration of the United States with all of their military might and arsenal. And so if they decide to go off and start a war with a nation which they cannot defeat, knowing the United States will have to get involved. So it's very unwise, I think, in a political scene like that, to give another nation undying support. Whatever you do, we'll cover for you. Because now the United States is committed to war with Iran. And of course, Iran is allied with Russia and China. So there's two different fronts there that could easily begin Third World War and devolve into nuclear war. And so I'm pretty sure that that's what we'll be getting into in the next months, years of this Trump administration. But in another sense, we're looking at things politically. I mean, the nationalists are all about, the globalists, the communists want to take down America. The Marxists are undermining it. They want to set up a new world order and all of that. And Trump, he's evoked the name of God to help make America great again. And he rightly pointed out that America was founded by Christians, and they were devout, even, they don't understand the Bible as we do, but they were fleeing from tyranny, and they wanted the freedom to worship the way they saw fit. And those original pilgrims and their offspring really founded the United States based upon those principles: freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. So all the things that make the work of Jehovah's Witnesses and every other religious person possible. But we've seen already how the leftists want to take that away. They've already engaged in quite a bit of censorship. They're really going after Elon Musk because he bought Twitter. Do you realize that they banned President Trump from Twitter? So he had, I don't know how many millions of followers, 70 million followers, and people would follow his tweets. And so you can't do that. President of the United States, no, you can't speak to anyone out there. But that's, the view of the patriots, the nationalists, and they think, they assume that God has blessed America, and I don't dispute that, but the assumption is that he always will. Well, think about that for a little bit. Israel was God's nation, wasn't it? He blessed them, protected them from their enemies, but it was always conditional that they obeyed him. And when they didn't, then he would allow invaders, foreigners, to come in and plunder. Read the book of the Judges. They would pray to Jehovah for help and get rid of their Baal idols, and Jehovah would feel sorry for them and raise up a savior, and they did okay for about 40 years, and then the next generation would lapse back into idolatry, and more invaders, same thing. Jehovah finally obliterated, well, not only Jerusalem where the temple was, but prior to that, the 10-tribe kingdom. They were taken off the land by the Assyrians, and then the Jews were taken off the land by the Babylonians. And they finally learned our lesson about idolatry. And Jehovah used Israel, though. Even after that, they came back and rebuilt Jerusalem and the temple, because Jehovah wasn't done with them at that time, because the Messiah had not come. But once the Messiah came, Jesus introduced himself and explained to them that the kingdom of God had drawn near. And he had many followers. And those who followed him to the end after he died and was resurrected, they were anointed to become a new nation of God's people, the spiritual Israel of God. Paul called it the Israel of God, that anointed congregation. And then what happened to the old Israel? Well, Paul explained that it served its purpose. The covenant, which made Israel possible, had become obsolete. Gave birth to Christ. He started a new covenant. And all the original Christians were Jewish, weren't they? Jesus was Jewish. All the apostles were Jewish. The 120 original Christians who were anointed on the day of Pentecost when flames of fire set upon their head, they were all Jewish. So, but that was the new nation, and eventually non-Jewish people were grafted in. And then God had Israel destroyed. Jerusalem was obliterated. And only recently, in 1948, a new state of Israel has come into existence, which is being hailed as a fulfillment of Bible prophecy, which, of course, it is not. So anyway, these patriots and evangelicals now, they really have high hopes that Trump is the new Messiah. Right? It seems that way. He has this messianic cloak put over his shoulders. He survived assassination. And in fact, he said in his acceptance speech that, he said, some people have told me that God saved my life so that I can save America. And, a lot of people believe that. And it certainly seemed miraculous. He turned his head at the right moment, and the bullet just nicked his ear. Oh. But maybe God saved him so that he could be the last president and oversee the takedown of the United States. Not that that would be his intention, but the fact that this new wave of conservatism and nation state and promoting nationalism and not wanting to be involved in wars all over the world, that's really going to stir up a hornet's nest, believe me. As I said, some elements in Britain are already trying to ignite World War III before he can even take office. So they're going to come after him if he does take office, and I believe he will at this point. But again, what the patriots do not take into consideration is, and even Jehovah's Witnesses don't really appreciate this, God intervenes, I should say, God will intervene in human affairs. I mean, the evangelicals have this crazy idea that suddenly Christians will just be levitated, raptured. They could be driving down the street and suddenly the car doesn't have a driver, and all those poor souls left behind will be tormented for 7 years. And then what happens after that? I don't know, the earth blows up or something, I don't know. But Jehovah's Witnesses have sort of a similar vague idea. They expect this great tribulation and God will just get rid of religion through human means. And then that just segues into Armageddon. So there's got to be, some learning here. I don't know how else to put it. But what I've come to appreciate is that God intervenes in human affairs, much like he did in ancient Egypt when he brought the Israelites out of captivity. He went into judgment with Egypt and Pharaoh, and he brought a series of plagues upon them. They knew who they were dealing with. Pharaoh at first said, I don't know Jehovah, and what's more? Well, he found out who Jehovah was, didn't he? So I came to appreciate about 25 years ago that God's intervention into human affairs will be marked by the takedown of the leading nation of the world. And we know who that is. Egypt was the first world power. And the Bible portrays 7 world powers, 7 empires that will have dealings with God's people throughout the generations. And in Revelation, those 7 are depicted as a 7-headed wild beast. The last head of that beast is the Anglo-American dual world power. And what happens to that beast? John saw in vision that it received a mortal blow, what seemed like a mortal blow, but then it recovered. So government will go out of existence temporarily, as if it had been killed. Won't that be a terrifying thing? It will be, believe me. In the 30th chapter of Ezekiel, Jehovah links this toppling of Egypt with his day. And Jehovah says, wail, alas, the day is coming, for the day is near. Yes, a day of Jehovah is near. It will be a day of clouds, an appointed time of nations. And then he goes on to say, a sword will come against Egypt, and panic will overtake Ethiopia. When the slain fall in Egypt, its wealth will be taken, and its foundations are torn down. Well, as I mentioned, Ethiopia and Egypt are mentioned in the book of Daniel. During the time of the end, the king of the north subjugates Egypt, takes its wealth, the silver and gold and the hidden treasures. But here Ezekiel says that this is the day of Jehovah. If you go over to the 31st chapter, Jehovah gives an illustration. And he likened this greatest nation to this giant cedar tree. And it says it was the biggest tree in the whole garden of God. The Garden of Eden, he calls it. Well, why would God refer to the nations of the world as the Garden of Eden? Because after Adam and Eve were expelled from Eden, God made provision for national governments to rule over mankind. Paul called them the superior authorities whom God has arranged in their relative positions. So even though Satan is the god of this world and he has tremendous authority, God has not abdicated his authority. And so he's used kings. Well, he used the Persians, didn't he? They freed God's people from captivity to Babylon. In fact, in Daniel again, it says that the angel came to support Darius, the king of Persia, a pagan king. So anyway, he goes on to describe this majestic, beautiful tree, higher than all the other trees. No other cedars in the garden of God could compare to it. It's the greatest nation. And all the other trees of the garden of God envied it. And it goes on to say everyone wanted to live under its shade. America was the land of opportunity. Millions of people from all over the world have immigrated to the United States, legally, most of them, and have enjoyed the privileges of this country. But Jehovah gives the order, and the tree is chopped down. And it sends shockwaves through the world. So that is the beginning of the day of Jehovah, the beginning of an appointed time of nations, the beginning of the time of the end. Technically, the time of the end begins somewhat before that, when the pushing began, so it might begin unnoticeably at first until the world war breaks out. And that's what Jesus said. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And that's going to take this big tree down. How it will play out now, I can't say. But as I mentioned, there's a couple of flashpoints here that could easily be triggered to set off nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and lead into a nuclear war. There's another prophecy in another book of the Bible that talks about this very same scenario in the book of Isaiah, the 19th chapter. And again, talk about human intervention. 19:1, it says, a pronouncement against Egypt. Look, Jehovah is riding on a swift cloud and coming into Egypt. The worthless gods of Egypt will tremble before him, and the heart of Egypt will melt within it. And I will incite Egyptians against Egyptians, and they will fight one another, each against his brother and his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. Well, I've been expecting this prophecy to play out in the form of a civil war. Egyptian against Egyptian, being the modern day Americans. And other people are talking about it now. I was talking about it years ago, only because of this. But now things are coming into focus, aren't they? There's already demonstrations and the promise of unrest, try to disrupt an inauguration. And they're capable of quite a bit of mischief. But it's interesting how it says, that the worthless gods of Egypt will tremble. Well, the literal Egyptians worshipped all kinds of gods, and Isis and Horus, but there are false gods in the United States too, and one of them is Jesus, and the Trinitarian Jesus, whom they think is, the benefactor, the protector of America. Well, he won't be when Jehovah comes riding in on a swift cloud. And if you want to know the truth about it, when this prophecy is fulfilled in the greater, it will be Jesus riding in on his celestial chariot as king, because he represents Jehovah. All the things we read in the New and the Old Testament, so-called, the Hebrew prophecies about the day of Jehovah, and Jehovah doing this and that. It's really Jesus. There is a day of the Lord's day, the day belonging to Jesus Christ. And he will, of course, vindicate his Father's name, Jehovah. And it goes on down to, there's a lot to say. I should do a separate video on the 19th chapter. But God chides the advisors of Pharaoh. In verse 11, he says, the princes of Zoan, that was a city in Egypt, princes of Zoan are foolish. The wisest advisors of Pharaoh give unreasonable advice. How can you say to Pharaoh, I am a descendant of wise ones, a descendant of ancient kings? Where then are your wise men? Let them tell you if they know what Jehovah of armies has decided concerning Egypt. The princes of Zoan have acted foolishly. The princes of Noph have been deceived. The chiefs of her tribes have led Egypt astray. Jehovah has poured out on her a spirit of confusion, and they've led Egypt astray, and wherever she goes, like a drunk, staggering in his vomit. And Egypt will not have any work to do, whether for the head or the tail or the shoot or the rush. So we don't know how God's presence will be manifest, but he's telling us before it happens that widespread confusion, not knowing the way out, being deceived, the leaders, the congressmen, the leading men being deceived. By who? Well, it says the fierce-looking king in the 8th chapter of Daniel will succeed by deception. And he's, of course, the same entity as the king of the north, who will be successful against his enemy, the king of the south. So we've seen an era of deception and lies and falsehood and disinformation, just a flood of it. And I'm afraid it's just beginning. Anyway, exciting times we're living in, right? As they say. Hopefully I'll see you next Sunday. Thanks for watching.